One of the things that can really bring our culture back away from the edge of chaos is if we as individuals can have minds centered around the concept of enlightenment. This idea that we ourselves can be free thinkers, who we can indulge in critical thinking, and we can make our lives better by being personally responsible for truth, is something that I think is so important. And when I say personal responsible for truth, I mean we ourselves are going to say we're not going to rely on other people to have truth handed down to us, but we ourselves, we want to understand truth in our world. Again, if we're talking about truth, it's important for me to articulate that the historical relevance of truth is the idea of reliable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But I want to start off this conversation with something that I seen a few years back when in Ferguson, Missouri, there was riots and things going on, and they had just released from the grand jury this information that they weren't going to indict the police officer. And they were interviewing a lady who was a councilwoman, and they were asking her, is it appropriate to be rioting if you're going to be legally honest and intellectually honest? This is the new evidence which came out. This is what has happened. This has been well investigated and corroborated. Is it appropriate to be rioting? And her response is, we do not have to be legally or intellectually honest because we are angry. And it was at this point that I realized that something had changed in our culture. I was sitting at home with when this happened. I was there with some family members, and we were watching this, and we realized that truth was no longer something which moved people to create policies for life, whether it be as individuals or people from, even in public policy. People had moved away from the central idea that truth is how we shape our lives. And it's a very dangerous thing to remove truth from the public dialogue and to be more invested in things like emotions and how we feel at a given time and place than to be invested in truth.
As Dylan hinted at earlier, the word truth, if we understand the history of the concept, means reliable. If something is true, then we can rely on it to function well in reality. If we are told something and it is true and we base our lives around it, it normally turns out to be pretty effective. Whereas if we're told something which is not reliable and we base our lives on it, then we become disconnected from reality.
So in this conversation about truth, I think one of the most heartbreaking things is, especially in the example that was given earlier, if truth had been where people were orienting their lives, if they were trying to seek out what was reliable, and really in the bigger picture, more than just what those particular circumstances were, but what was going to be reliable, what was kind of the essence of the situation, then they could have moved more towards healing. But by allowing kind of destructive behavior to be angry, and then to not just be angry, but be violently angry, that it actually agitated. So moving away from truth, we can see these clear examples of where more chaos happened. Instead of kind of reining in back from the chaos or seeing the suffering and learning how to heal and to move through it, we just see just more suffering, more pain, and more tragedies happening. And so this is why really it's important for us to have this conversation of where are we going to have kind of our ground of all being? Where is our foundation laid? And if we're moving away from truth, we're going to find ourselves disconnected from reality and really working productively in our world.
Yeah, and again, the truth will set you free. This is a very practical thing. And in our modern world, people tend to think that truth and empirical fact are the exact same thing. And if I'm going to be using the language of empirical, I want to point out that this is not the word empire. They do look very similar, but the concepts are a bit different. Something which is an empirical fact is something which is reliable. Again, we can see the element of truth there, but it's reliable, but it's also verifiable and reproducible. That's a little bit different than the concept of truth, though you can't have empirical fact without truth. But truth itself is something which is able to transcend our awareness of the world. Because again, the world is definitely more complicated than we are aware of it. We ourselves as individuals are more complicated than we are aware of it. And we can find things in the world and rely on them more than we're necessarily able to understand them. And certainly, we're more able to rely on more things than we are to go out and verify and reproduce everything. Again, we only have so much time and energy, and we can't do a closed study on every single thing that happens in our daily lives, but yet we can rely on them without being able to turn everything into empirical fact. And it really is just important to articulate that there is a little bit different, and we need to just understand that truth is reliable.
And so with that, we really do see where truth transcends this empirical knowledge. So it's more than just kind of the pieces of information you can write down on a piece of paper after like an experiment or something like that. And not that empirical facts should be disregarded. But we have to put them in their right place and seeing and understanding that truth works even in our complex world where we may not be able to go back and reproduce or verify a particular thing. But in this conversation, Dylan, you had a couple interesting stories you want to share.
Yeah, so to just point out before I do share some stuff, it is important to realize empirical fact is very valuable, but we can't conflate truth with empirical fact, because what you end up happening is people say, well, we can't verify that or reproduce it, so we're just going to discard it like it's unreliable. That's not necessarily the case. A couple of interesting examples of this. I have a groundskeeper here at the church, and he oftentimes he calls and tells me the things that are going on. If somebody gets in out of the hospital, he'll call in and let me know. And again, we small talk on the phone, and it's not something where I remember every exact detail he says on the phone, much less the tone he may have or all the ways he phrases things. But he may call me one morning and tell me somebody's home from the hospital, and that's a great piece of information. If I get in the car and drive to their house, I can rely on that information to be true. And if I go to that person's house, they're going to be there so I can go and visit them. However, I can't necessarily verify the conversation outside of pulling up the phone records and showing, well, we did have a conversation. I can't verify everything in it if I didn't record it. And of course, nobody really records everything they do all day long. And I can't reproduce it. I can't be like, go back in time and do that again. We don't have the power to go back in time. We can't reproduce that. And again, it's something which isn't recorded, but yet we can still rely on it. And it's important to know that they're different things. Another quick example. Here in Tennessee, where we're at, there's animals all over the road this time of year. You can go out and see people who have hit deers, and they've hit deer and they've had damage to their car. You see people who run over squirrels and things like this all the time this time of year. Even though these things happen, you can go and you can hit a deer. I had a family member who ran over a deer the other day, and just because that happened, we may not be able to go in time and reproduce exactly how it happened. We can estimate it. We can somewhat verify it, though if the deer is not killed and they run off, we really can't totally figure out all the details of it, though it's reliable that it's there, and you can go and look at the car and see the damage, and you can tell for sure that it's happened. So that which is reliable can transcend what we can write down on paper. It's just important to keep that in mind.
Truth or reliability can transcend our awareness and certainly empirical verifiability.
And when people, instead of investing in truth, but they invest in emotional things and they invest in how they are at that time and place, they can end up in bad places because, again, as Amanda said earlier, you don't have the tools for resolution if you're not incorporating truth into your world. You can't really have empirical fact unless you have truth involved in it. If it's not reliable, well, then you can't reproduce it and you can't verify it and you can't rely on it in the future. It's just important for us to realize the relevance of truth in our lives. And we have a quote from G.K. Chesterton. It's again from the book Orthodoxy, I think is worth sharing in the midst of this.
The man who tries to think without proper first principles goes mad. The man who thinks at the wrong end.
And so again, we see that when we pursue truth, when we have the discipline to look at our situations and decide what is actually happening or what is going on, what are the reasons and the rationales, we can find that we have the tools to move towards a place of liberty and freedom, that we can actually be constructive and provide resolutions to some of the tragedies and other evils in our world, that we can stand up against them because we understand what is going on and how to appropriately move to a place of healing. And so this is just something that we have to continue to pursue and be disciplined in it, because it's very easy just to go off of what we may think is happening.
All right. And with that, we'll be back in a moment.